Making thin cuts on the table saw can be nerve-wracking and downright hazardous if you're not careful. It becomes challenging to push the workpiece past the blade reliably, and kickback is a real possibility. There are a few ways to make this operation safer. One is using a push block like the one I have here. I use it to cut strips around a ½ inch wide, but when I drop down to something as narrow as 1/8 of an inch, I get uneasy, worried that the blade might tear through the tool. Although the leg is replaceable, the sudden shock is never good while operating the table saw. Another way is to build a straightforward jig. You just need a strip of plywood, a wooden block for the handle, and a thin piece for the heel. I'm keeping this jig basic, nothing fancy. First, I'll screw the block, which serves as a handle, onto the plywood strip. Drill some pilot holes using a countersink bit and secure it. For the heel, I'm using a random thin scrap of wood I found, but you can use any thin piece. I'll attach it to the back edge, offset slightly so it doesn't hit the fence. Once again, I'll drill a countersink hole first, then screw it in flush with the bottom side of the jig. Notice how the heel extends a bit to the left side. That's intentional. Let's test it. My plywood is exactly 4 1/4 to cut strips that are 1/8 wide. Now you can see there's area with painter's tape. After a few passes, it definitely works. I'm getting thin, uniform strips. Still, I'm somewhat uneasy about potential kickback, so I think I can improve the jig for safety. I have another strip of plywood the same length but precisely 2 3/4 inches wide, and I'm going to mount it underneath the jig. The crucial detail is that this piece must be the same thickness as the stock I'm cutting. I want it flush against the fence, so I'll flip it on its side, clamp it, then drive in a few screws. I'll also swap the small heel for a bigger piece. I just need it to cover the entire back end and extend a few inches to the left. Let's give it a try. Now, I set my fence to 2 3/4 minus 1/8 inches. 2 3/4 inches for the jig's width plus 1/8 inch for the thin strips. This feels much more secure. The jig basically shields the blade and the material, and I hardly need to guide the piece with my other hand. The heel and jig do most of the work. I love it. This is a safe and efficient way to cut consistent, thin strips in batches. I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of circular saws and don't use them much. It's tricky to line up your cut and get a perfectly straight, clean edge. Plus, cutting exactly on a pencil line can be tough. I usually opt for a track saw, which is fantastic for precise, clean cuts in sheet goods. But not everyone has the budget for a track saw, especially if it's only an occasional need. The good news is that you can transform almost any circular saw into a makeshift track saw by creating a simple guide rail. You can make it any length you need, but I find 3 to 4 feet is a nice middle ground. You'll need one piece about 8 inches wide and another that's 2 to 3 inches wide. First, flip your saw upside down to roughly measure the distance from the blade to the edge of its base plate. It doesn't need to be exact, just an estimate. Then add about 1/2 inch to that measurement and transfer it to the larger board. Ensure that the reference edge you mark is on the same side as your saw blade, whether your saw is blade right or blade left. Apply some glue, clamp the second board right on that line, and attach it with flathead screws, after drilling some countersink holes. The final step is trimming the edge to create a zero clearance edge, which improves accuracy and helps reduce tear out. As you can see, it's a straightforward jig. Remember to leave enough material on the opposite side for clamping so the motor and housing don't interfere. You'll also likely have some extra material on the blade side, which you can trim off to create a perfect zero clearance base. To prevent tear out underneath, place the jig on some scrap wood first. Then set your blade depth so that the tips just poke below the jig. Carefully cut along the entire edge, keeping the base plate snug against the fence portion. Once you've done that, the guide is ready. Let's try it. Always support your work so it doesn't pinch the blade. I'll mark my intended cut line, place the guide's edge on the line, and clamp everything down. Then I'll run the saw along the guide, keeping it pressed against the fence. And voila, a perfect, crisp, square cut. You're welcome. The next jig is incredibly easy to make and highly versatile. Some refer to it as a tenoning jig, but it can do more than just tenons. All you need are 3 pieces of plywood. The idea is to build a simple frame that slips over your table saw fence. It should fit snugly, so measure your fence width, in my case, around 3.5 inches, and rip the plywood accordingly. The outer piece doesn't need to be very tall, so I'll cut it down to a more manageable size. Looks good. A quick check shows it slides smoothly, not too tight or loose. This is our jig's basic form. Next, I'll clamp everything so I can fasten it together with screws. The final touch is adding a vertical piece that acts as a backstop to support the workpiece while feeding it through the saw blade. This vertical piece should be perfectly square, so I use a speed square to align it and then clamp it in place. I suggest adding a handle. A simple wood block works great. It slides nicely. You can also apply a thin coat of paste wax if you want it to glide even better along the fence. So, like I mentioned, it's often called a tenoning jig, but I'll admit I've never tackled a true mortise and tenon project. Still, there are times when you might need to notch the end of a board, like I did for a flip-top planer sander cart. This jig is ideal for that. It's also handy for cutting bridle joints if that's your thing. Or maybe you want a steep angle cut on a board, like a pizza peel handle. Just tilt your blade, clamp the board vertically onto the jig, and run it through. I made a similar jig for crafting castle joints for a coffee table. Because the 2x2 posts were quite large, I made that jig taller and added a second horizontal crosspiece for extra stability. You can also drill holes or cut openings in the vertical face for easier clamping access. The beauty of jigs like these is how quick and simple they are to build, so you can knock one together anytime you need a custom solution. I'm always looking for ways to improve my workspace, even small upgrades. Have fun experimenting. I hope you picked up a new tip or discovered a jig you'd like to try in your shop. Let me know which one is your favorite in the comments. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.